Have you ever met a Native person and wondered whether they were a real Indian? Like, are they actually connected enough to their culture to legitimately be a Native person? Before making your conclusion, remember that it's not up for any non-Native person to determine whether or not someone is Native enough. It is also important to remember why a Native person might not have the amount of cultural involvement that you think they should. It is documented in countless pieces of legislation that the goal of the American government's relationship with Native peoples was to assimilate Native people into mainstream culture. Kill the Indian, save the man. So when the government put in place actual structures to assimilate people, structures that were usually physically, emotionally, and sexually violent, most people assimilated as a mechanism for survival. The U.S. government was literally beating Native culture out of people and created legislation that specifically banned the practice of cultural and spiritual traditions. So now, many Native communities are less connected to their traditions than they would like to be. This is not their fault, and contemporary Native people are not deserving of criticism on this issue. Which brings us to the next issue that might pop into your head when judging whether someone is a real Indian or not. This one really challenges what we think we know about genetics, race, and physical appearance. Many of us tend to think that an Indigenous person should have certain physical features that prove they are descended from other Indigenous people. When a person with features that are different from the image we have in our heads identifies as Native, we might instinctively question their legitimacy since they don't match our assumptions of how we think Native people should look. But genetics and Native identity don't really work that way. Not only have centuries of assimilation and involuntary and voluntary intermarriage changed the physical appearance of most Native people, but characteristics like skin color and hair type naturally vary by distance from the equator. This is referred to as clinal variation. So not all natives looked the same even before the invasion and colonization of native lands. Because of this, it is totally likely that Native people you meet will not look like the stereotypical images permeating pop culture. For many, but not all Native communities, having a strong family lineage that connects a person to the community is more important than whether or not a person looks Native. As you will see, though, even this gets really complicated. Sometimes nativeness is determined through non-genetic physical associations like wearing beaded or turquoise jewelry, growing one's hair long, wearing traditional fashion, or taking on other outward-facing symbols of indigeneity. While fashion, art, hair, tattoos, and such are an important way to express identity, it isn't the case for everyone. Remember, colonialism made it illegal to practice Native culture for centuries. Sometimes outwardly communicating one's nativeness physically can increase feelings of danger, insecurity, or of inviting unwanted attention. At the same time, for some, proudly showing outward signs of being Native can be a positive and powerful force. Ultimately, a person's identity, legitimacy, or culture should not be determined by their outward appearance, and it is never for a non-Native person to judge. Remember how we mentioned that things were going to get complicated? This is where it happens. Probably every Native person in the country has been asked about the percentage of Native blood they have. This question is referring to blood quantum, and it is easily one of the most controversial elements of Native identity. When Native people were first forcibly moved to reservations, the U.S. federal government issued requirements for tribal membership. One such requirement was that of blood quantum, referring to the amount of Native blood one has. For example, a person's grandmother may have been full-blooded Native from a specific tribe, but through intermarriage, their descendants could have less than that. While someone's grandmother was full-blooded, their mother may be 1/2, and they may be 1/4. You may have heard percentages like this thrown around, but what are the actual implications of trying to identify someone by their blood quantum? Without a certain amount of blood, some Native people lose access to their Native identity under the federal government. Like, the government won't acknowledge the Native part of your heritage unless you meet their requirement. This is even the case for people whose close relatives are clearly Native or who have been raised with their Native family members within their cultural community. Blood quantum requirements are designed to ensure that Native populations constantly reduce in size, and it has been used to place extra pressure on Native people to increase their children's blood quantum. In communities that require a certain blood quantum for membership, every child a Native person has with someone outside of their tribal community risks reducing the size of their community by having a child who does not meet the requirements. Imagine feeling pressure or insecurity over choosing a romantic partner with whom you plan to have children and having to consider whether or not your decision will determine the ability of your child to claim their community as theirs. For example, if a Native woman has a child with someone outside of her tribal community, it is possible that her child will not meet the blood quantum requirement for her tribe. This may mean that her child does not qualify to be a tribal member. For a woman whose community, culture, and sense of belonging is connected to her tribal affiliation, having one's child rejected from the tribe can be heartbreaking and can place extra strain on the family as a whole. Seeing that blood quantum requirements put the Native population at risk, many tribes have given up the practice. Not only this, but there are significant flaws in genetic tests that people take to prove their ancestry, like a lack of genome samples from Native American people, or the fact that genetic tests may focus on only your X or Y chromosome. So these aren't totally reliable. As Native communities come to understand that determining nativeness by blood quantum is likely to lead to significantly reduced community sizes in future generations, many Native families are emphasizing the importance of cultural connection, community engagement, and having a strong, clearly documented family lineage. Still, some tribal governments place a blood quantum requirement on their own people. It is important to remember, though, that blood quantum is a colonial invention and is not traditional to Native culture. Its purpose is to erase the Native population by making it increasingly more difficult to identify as Native.